Hi everyone, I'm Tina and welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. Because I was lucky enough to get to go to a cottage last month for a week, I was able to read 6 books in August, and 3 of them physical books because of the cottage, instead of an e-reader, which is nice. I prefer physical books, but you know, I like my Kindle thing. I'm also super stoked because my own novel, yay, What Branches Grow, reached the semi-finals, the top 20 of the Kindle Book Awards, so that's really cool. Hopefully next month I'll be able to say it's a finalist, who knows, we'll see. But it's also on sale this month, the Kindle version, for 99 cents, so you could go and buy that if you want. Anyway, enough about that. The first book I read in August was The Raven by Jonathan Janz. It's a horror action novel, I guess. I received it as an ARC from NetGalley in exchange for a fair review. And while I read a lot of post-apocalyptic novels, I don't usually consider them horror. I consider them more kind of like adventure, but this one is definitely a horror novel. The cover is pretty cool. I mean, it kind of reminds me of that guy from Resident Evil 4. The one that like sells you stuff. He's like, what do you buy it? Take it at a high price. Like, I can't do the voice. Anyway, that's mainly why I chose the book, and because it said post-apocalyptic in the description. Anyway, so what's it about? So 2 years ago, rogue scientists released a biological weapon that unleashed tamped-down supernatural aspects in human DNA, which turned people into vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural horror creatures. So Des is traveling the now post-apocalyptic landscape trying to find his kidnapped girlfriend. So as someone with no powers, he has to rely on his survival skills and his luck to survive. So the novel begins really strong. There's a couple riveting few chapters that kept me like literally on the edge of my seat. I mean, I was reading it in the middle of the night in the dark because, you know, I usually read my book on my Kindle while my husband sleeps and my baby sleeps, and I'm like in the middle, like hunched down. So that didn't help with the creepiness of it. And then the rest of the novel follows at kind of a slightly slower pace, but with plenty of action scenes. The introduction to new types of monsters was fun, and it was sometimes surprising. Like, he doesn't give you a big exposition at the start, being like, here are the monsters I will encounter. You get kind of reveals of people's powers. It's really neat, and it's not just werewolves and monsters. It's not just werewolves and vampires, which was kind of cool. I appreciate that the novel provides kind of a simplistic, pseudo-scientific explanation for the supernatural aspects of the story, but it doesn't belabor it, and because the reason isn't really the purpose of the story. What are you doing down there, little goat? The action horror scenes are unapologetically violent, but they don't stray into torture porn. Like, there's a very fine line between, like, violence and that. And it's a really hard balance, I find, to strike. And I had some pretty violent scenes in my book, and I actually toned them down because I was like, ew, they're kind of icky. And this one goes further than mine, but doesn't go further enough that I'm like, you're a serial killer in real life. And I appreciate it. I really appreciate that all sexual violence was off screen, and there's not a ton of it. As soon as I saw that there were satyrs as one of the monsters, I was like, oh no, I might have to stop reading this. But the novel easily showed that it wasn't going to trigger me in that regard, so I was thoroughly enjoyed by this action adventure, which has a very dark, kind of no-holds-barred setting. It feels a bit Western too, which is kind of fun. I always like Westerns. I had trouble putting it down because Janz really excels in his twists and turns. Fortunately, I didn't care much about Des himself. He doesn't have a lot of depth. It's mainly just showing kind of what he had in his previous life, like what he lost because of the horrors. He doesn't really like talk about anything else. Some of his choices didn't make sense to me. He felt kind of generic in terms of like a horror story protagonist because his motivation to rescue his girlfriend isn't compelling because we don't know anything or care about the girlfriend. She's just like the girlfriend. So, you know, I was just like, well, if I knew about her, maybe I would care, but I really don't care. So I had trouble kind of worrying about his end result of the story. I think a way to fix that is if the journal excerpts, because there's a few from Des's journal, were actually her journal excerpts, we might have been able to, you know, learn about her, and that would have been kind of cool. There's also no women in the novel until 36% in. We do get an explanation, and the explanation, for once, actually makes a lot of sense. And the women that do arrive on the scene are very competent and have agency, and they're both antagonists and allies. So I rarely do this, but I actually forgive the first part for being kind of a sausage fest because it actually makes sense why. And you know what? I'm glad. Because the first few scenes are quite gory, I'm glad I didn't have to see a woman, like, you know, destroyed. So, you know, overall, it's a thoroughly engrossing, gore-splattered romp through a horror monster-infested world that doesn't feel like every other vampire, werewolf, etc. story. It breathes new life into these old threats in a way that actually wants me to read the next book. And, you know, there's some interesting twists, some fun action scenes, and, you know, it's kind of saying that the worst aspects of human nature aren't really what we turn into, but what we were to begin with. There's one thing I want to talk about that's a bit of a spoiler. So if you plan on reading this novel, skip ahead to this time. And so now I'm going to go. Okay, so I absolutely love that Keaton was a Minotaur. I love Minotaurs. They're probably my favorite mythological creature. I don't know why. Maybe it has something to do with the House of Leaves, which I like. You know, I love the actual story. I think it's hilarious about the myth of why the Minotaur comes to be. And I did not expect Keaton to be one. So when he like emerges as a Minotaur, I was like, what? This is great. So yeah, I 100% adored that. And yeah, anyway, thanks. So I give this book a 4 out of 5 stars, and I recommend it to anybody that likes horror, who likes action horror, who likes post-apocalyptic, and who likes vampires and werewolves and crap like that. So, alright. The second book I read in August was Hidden Realm by T.R. Slauf. It's a dark fantasy, and I reviewed this novel on whisperingstories.com, where I am a guest reviewer. It's a self-published novel. So I really like the cover. I think the wolves are terrifying, and they are in the story. So Hidden Realm, book 1 of the Legends of Lightning series, is an ambitious dark fantasy. So it starts with Esther, who's a librarian in our world, who has been recently plagued by these nightmares where she's chased through the woods by these wolves. As wounds begin to appear on her body after these nightmares, she searches for a way to discover what's going on and how to stop it. So most of the novel takes place in the other realm, though, where Esther has to go to in order to save it from evil forces. It's kind of a chosen one story. You know, we don't really understand why Esther is the chosen one. It doesn't really explain to my liking. There is a premise, but I was kind of like, I need a bit more than this. The novel's strengths, though, are its dark, gritty, and unapologetically sordid and evocative imagery. It moves at a quick pace with interesting side characters and a villain with a very tragic backstory, though she remains on the periphery for most of the story. As the novel progresses, it's revealed to be a fairy tale adaptation. So they take on the Brothers Grimm stories and Beauty and the Beast, which is not Brothers Grimm, in a quite interesting and rather kind of innovative way. You know, given that there's a deluge of fairy tale reimaginings at present, like every 5 seconds. They're usually YA, so it's interesting to see an adult one. In retrospect, you know, the warriors being called the huntsmen should have tipped me off to this earlier. But it isn't until about halfway through the novel that the world expands from like the hunting camp into, you know, adaptations of these classic tales. So this did allow for the novel to develop its own story before kind of being tied to these existing mythos, which was, you know, a well-crafted way to do it. Unfortunately, while the novel was quite enthralling, there were some issues that took away from it for me. There was a decent attempt to give characters depth, but Esther fell very flat to me. I love that she wasn't a stereotype or a trope. She's a person of color, she's Asian, but we aren't given insight into kind of her deepest thoughts. She doesn't ruminate on her past life at all when she's in the new realm, which I found rather unrealistic. And while she's brave and rather stubborn, there's nothing much else to say about her. I cared about a few other characters more than I did Esther. And this could be because the novel commits quite a few show-don't-tell narrative issues often, which as well as drifting into the passive voice quite often as well. So, you know, the other character, Oisin, he's another main character, he was intriguing as well, but I'm unsure why he kept Esther in the dark so often. It felt like a way to keep the reader surprised rather than a personality flaw on his part. So, some kind of, I guess, novice issues in this regard. There's also a few minor questions and inconsistencies that are not resolved. Maybe they will be in later novels. Overall, you know, it's an interesting read that will please those who enjoy a dark and adult retelling of classic tales, and also those who enjoy fantasy with heavy themes. One comment though, trigger warning, there is a bit about sexual abuse. It doesn't go into detail, but it's referenced for a bit, and I was like taken aback by it, so I wanted to warn people about that because I don't like that. I give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I recommend it to, yeah, people that like dark fantasy. I had to move positions because the sun was just like beaming into my face. So anyway, the third book that I read in August was Tongues of the Moon by Philip José Farmer, and it is an old school sci-fi. I found this novel at the used bookstore in my city for like $2. It's one of those books that I buy for the cover, and I mean, look at this cover though. This is why I buy them. I mean, look at this ship. It's like Boom! Anyway, it's one of the ones also that I review for my old school sci-fi blog, where I kind of go into it more in depth and kind of like do an analysis on it. So you can find that on nostromopublications.com/oldschoolsci-fi if you want to read my review about this. So this review is not going to talk about the that in depth. I'm just going to do a regular review. So this novel is about how the world ends. Humanity nuked itself, of course, leaving the world a wasteland. There are colonies on the moon, Mars, and Ganymede. When the Earth is nuked, leaders on the moon vie for control, spiraling into an attack first, kind of defense against the other colony worlds. So this book is from like 1963 or something like that. So it's definitely a Cold War inspired tale. So we follow this dude named Broward, an American doctor, and he's a physical anthropologist who is also somehow like militarily proficient. It's not really explained, but he's able to like shoot dudes with a 45 like right in the face. I guess maybe he has some kind of war training. He doesn't, I don't know, they don't really tell you. So he's sent on various missions by this guy named Scone, who is the leader of the moon. Why his name is Scone is beyond me, because it made me laugh every time, because I was like, what a stupid name. Broward is like a good guy, and that he feels guilty about being sent on these missions to destroy the rest of the human race. I mean, though, if you don't feel guilty about that, what is wrong with you? So, but in the end, he actively works to prevent this from happening. That's the basic plot. It's a rather short novel. While the concepts were likely kind of interesting for the 1960s, the story is bogged down by an extremely passive voice, boring characters, and too much explanation of now outdated, very laughable technology. And, you know, there's a kind of the most basic of attempts to include women. There's some women in STEM. They're mainly treated as side characters for the most part. There's one woman who does one thing, and then there's one woman who is the girlfriend. But basically women in this novel are considered for the reproductive potential more than anything else, and are characterized as being overly emotional when they're told that they have to reproduce the human race without their choice. Yeah, of course. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the technology in the novel because I love the technology in these old novels because it's so dumb. So it's the best part though, because, you know, we have laser beams and nuclear devastation. The nuclear weapons in this novel are called cobalt bombs, which is interesting. The tongues in the title, this is also why I bought the book, because it's called Tongues of the Moon, which is a weird image, refer to a flexible beam of straightened out photons, which is apparently the ultimate development of the laser. Whatever. It's not a 1960s novel, though, without lasers. There are other interesting weapons using kind of pseudo-scientific terms like graviomagnetic drives, and there's some kind of stun gun that's explained away by it being like, the guy's like, or the one guy is like, where'd you get that from? He's like, oh, it's new. All right. Apparently also it takes 1.5 hours to get from the moon to Earth using their tiny little spaceships. But when they receive a technical readout from the ship, it prints out on a little piece of paper. I'm assuming it's the dot matrix printer too. I couldn't take that. I lost it. I'm like, what? You can get the moon in an hour and a half, but you have to use paper for your readouts. Anyway, my favorite old technology has a little cameo, microfiche. I love the microfiche machines because it's so silly. And everyone in the 1950s to the 1970s seemed to think that these would be, you know, around in the new millennium. I absolutely love it. It's in like every sci-fi book. Overall, you know, it's a mundane, though, uninteresting novel with a weird title. If you want to read my in-depth review, as I said, about geopolitics, race, and female representation, you can head on over to my blog. I'll include a link in the description, but I give it a 2 out of 5 stars, 2 out of 5 tongues, and I recommend it to, like, only the most hardcore of, like, old sci-fi fanatics, because it's a little dry. The second book that I read while lying on the couch at the cottage was Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. It is a collection of short stories, contemporary but also a little weird. I received this book from my sister for Christmas. She likes to pick random books for me to read, so this is a fun surprise. And the cover is beautiful. Look at it, sparkly. Oh my god. As usual with most short story collections, it's really hard to provide kind of an overall review because the quality of the stories vary. With this collection, there were kind of 2 or 3 stories that I absolutely loved, but there wasn't one that I didn't really enjoy. You know, every story is engaging, well written, and also, you know, a lot of fun. So while there's a clear feminist lens, or at least female feminist perspective to all the stories, The stories aren't one depressing kind of story after another. You know, I wouldn't call them uplifting, but they aren't all doom and gloom, which is nice. I read that one, Her Body and Other Parties by somebody a few months ago, and it was like every story was like, oh my god. So this one is definitely not like that. The stories range from realistic slices of life to stories with a hint of the supernatural to kind of metaphorical exercises. So Armfield writes with a kind of refreshing mix of clear and concise prose peppered with these thoughtful and thought-provoking metaphors. I'm going to go into depth with a few of the stories, just a couple. So Mantis is the first story in the collection, and it's a great way to start it. And is the end result, is it metaphorical? Is it literal? You know, you could take it either way, but the lead up to it, the subtle hints, the way it kind of draws you in with like questioning is really well done. My favorite in the collection was called The Great Awake. It reminded me of the short story Light and the Sufferer by Jonathan Lethem. Not because it was a similar concept, but because it had the same kind of tone and a casual acceptance of the supernatural element to it. I googled the title, The Light and the Sufferer, to make sure I was quoting, like listing it properly, and I discovered there's a movie made about it, and I was like, really? It didn't get great reviews, so I don't think I'll watch it. Another of the short stories I liked was Granite. So this one had a really interesting twist at the end, though I think the story should have been called Gorgon, and I think this one's a lot deeper than, you know, upon first read than you think. And then the final one that I'm going to talk about is the titular one of the collection called Salt Slow. And I actually think it's my least favorite of the stories. I think because I've read so many pregnant during the apocalypse stories, and because I've just given birth a few months ago, so I tend to pick apart kind of that aspect of it. I mean, this one was better done than most, but I'm just kind of sick of that idea. Like, oh no, we have to give birth in a terrible like place. Like, give me a break. I had a home birth and an episiotomy, and I'm fine. I don't need to go on and on about it. And the story is basically just Waterworld with sea monsters, so I don't know, I didn't find it overly engaging. Unfortunately, because you think that, like, you know, the title card story would be the best one, but in this case it wasn't. But that's okay, because this was a great collection. I give it a 4 to 5 stars. I recommend it pretty much to anybody that likes short stories. There's nothing overly like disturbing in it or anything like that, which is nice, and they're really interesting and well written stories, and I recommend them. And thank you to my sister Nikki for giving the book to me. She loves to pick like random books for me, and I really appreciate it. So the next book that I read while lying on the couch at the cottage was Dragon Road by Joseph Brassey. I actually bought this book in paperback from Amazon. It's a sequel. Seriously, I don't buy books that often because they're so overpriced. Like a paperback's like $40 or something, and I need to make sure they're worth it. I usually just like ask for books for Christmas. I love the library. I haven't been to the library for a while because of COVID, and I can't wait to kind of go back once my NetGalley arcs are done because I have so many of those. So I would call this book a space opera fantasy. I don't believe there's kind of an equivalent for space opera in fantasy other than to call it low fantasy, which I think is elitist, and I will not use it. There's also spaceships in it, even though it is, and they're kind of steampunky, but it's not steampunk, so space opera fantasy. Anyway, if you know fantasy or sci-fi, you kind of know what I'm getting at with the space opera aspect. I mean, though, look at the cover. Like, it's quite fun. I love the color palette, the kind of, like dark pastels, and you know what you're going to get when you look at the cover. So it's book 2 to Skyfarer, a book I reviewed back in March. I know it was during COVID. And in this story follows the crew of the Elysium when they arrive on a flying citadel in order to assist a massive city in choosing a new leader. So, you know, as they're helping with this, Elias, he's a former Dark Knight of the Dark Order, is dealing with this guilt and trauma in his past. He's trying to work through what he did and, you know, his involvement in like the war that he now realizes is unjust. And then you have Amy, the other main character, who is a wizard, and she's learning to take charge because she's currently the apprentice to an old wise wizard, and she has to kind of come into her own. And then throughout these two kind of character arcs, you have the Citadel being threatened by a mysterious necromancer as well as some other crap. Honestly though, I straight up love this novel. It is the perfect book to read on vacation, and it has all the things about fantasy wrapped up in a quick-moving, easy-to-read package that I love. It's got strong female characters, it's got tortured soul former villains, it's got a drawn-out, slow-burn romance, it's got a cool setting, like I love Flying Citadels, it's got necromancy, it's got magic that isn't overused, it's got magic that isn't overly explained, it's got giant sky monsters, steampunk-esque warships, and fancy swords. As a sequel though, it doesn't entirely stand on its own, and it definitely builds on the first book, so you definitely have to read Skyfarer first. We're given a little more personality to the crew of Elysium though, but I could have used a bit more, you know? Like, there are several new characters, one of whom that I absolutely loved, called Belit, or Bellet, I don't know. but again, I can't pronounce people's last names. That should be the name of my channel, is I can't pronounce people's names. I can't give this book a 5 out of 5, despite adoring it, because it has some narrative issues. It's crammed, why are you biting me? It's crammed so full of stuff, like people, concepts, plots, that there's so much going on. The story feels like it's told in this one big breath. There are hidden necromancers, prophecies, political maneuvering, missing friends. You know, there's so much happening in the story that it moves far too fast for anyone to have any downtime. I mean, it kept me addictively reading. It's one of those books that you finish a chapter and you're like, yeah, I could squeeze another one in, you like, you know, keep going. But just like the last book, I would have enjoyed a few more like team building moments. There's a couple, you know, the crew has a drink together at one point, and then there's also this kind of funny side part about this weird creature called a squibble, which was absolutely funny. I thought it was cute. Some people might be like, this is dumb, but I thought it was very funny. A few more senseless moments though, like that, would have pulled back the heavy punch that is the plot. Like, I very, very much enjoyed the drawn-out potential love story too, but it also needed more focus because it wasn't completely compelling because it's such sideburner so often. Anyway, despite all these kind of narrative problems, I'm still giving it 4 to 5 stars because it was so much fun and I want another one. So yes, give me another Drifting Lands book because they're a lot of fun. I recommend to anyone that likes kind of more lighthearted, easy to read fantasy. This is not Joe Abercrombie. This isn't even Game of Thrones. This is like, I can't even think of like, not Dragonlance, but like, you know, a bit more than that. But anyway, it's fun. The last book that I read in August, what I just squeezed in, was Captain Moxley and the Embers of the Empire. It's not even out yet at the point that I'm recording this because I got it as an art from NetGalley. I cannot talk. It's an adventure with kind of paranormal aspects by a guy named Dan Hanks. So the novel follows Captain Samantha Moxley, a former RAF pilot in World War II, and it's set several years after the war when she teams up with her archaeologist sister, her former pilot friend, and her sister's boyfriend to find an ancient superweapon before a shifty American agency that's teamed up with Nazis gets to it first. Okay. I mean, the best thing with this novel, honestly, is the cover. Look at it. It's fantastic. It reminds me of those movie covers now. They're like faux 70s. I think like Logan did one and Deadpool did one and whatever. I'll find some examples. They'll be up here somewhere in the ether of my video. It's a lot of fun, the cover. Now, the thing is, though, about the book itself, I kind of was waffling between what I thought about it, and I think I've settled on fond indifference. There are things that I really enjoyed about it, but the rest was rather kind of humdrum for an action-adventure. What I liked best about the novel was that Sam was a woman. To be completely honest, that's the thing I liked about it the most. Because instead of being like the plucky girlfriend of the hero, she's the Indiana Jones character. She's flying planes and fighting and punching dudes in the face and destroying stuff and driving buses through the desert and all this stuff. She never needs rescuing and she's tough as nails. I really appreciated that. I mean, how could I not? That's like the thing that I want books to have more of. The action scenes, too, were a lot of fun. He's really great at describing environments, fights, and movements extremely well. You know, I could really picture in my head kind of what was going on. In truth, you know, his action scenes held the story together for me. There's a bus chase scene that's fantastic. It was great. But there's some things I didn't really like about the story. The first thing was the paranormal aspects. So, not that I don't like paranormal aspects, it's just that this world wasn't very... He didn't really world build enough to explain why and how there are paranormal aspects in this universe. Like, is it an alternate reality? Is this something like Indiana Jones the Mummy where the characters don't believe in it at first and then, you know, supernatural stuff happens? You know, that kind of thing. Like, we're not really... I mean, ghost stories do that too, but they're kind of their own genre. Like, this is an adventure action. It's not really a science fiction, I guess. I just wasn't clear on kind of the setting, I guess you could say. I mean, I was aware that in World War II, the real Nazis actually had an interest in the paranormal and a whole sector kind of to study that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, though, does everybody know that? I mean, I studied World War II in university for a couple courses, not like I was a history major. And I also played Return to Castle Wolfenstein a lot for PS2, of course, because that's, you know, a veritable place to gain information. But I just wasn't sure. I just need some more clarification on the paranormal. The characterization was also lacking in this book. We only get the faintest glimpses into Sam's army days and why she joined the Air Force. From what I remember, there were women in the RAF, but they weren't fighter pilots. I think at best they were allowed to fly transports, but most were engineers or sanitation. So how and why Sam became a fighter pilot was something that I was really interested in. You know, it was kind of missing from the story. Like, are we to assume from this story that every woman was allowed to fly a Spitfire in World War II, but they just didn't do it? Because I'm pretty sure if women were allowed to fly Spitfires, that there would be a lot more female pilots. So I just didn't really understand that part. I wish we'd kind of been given a couple chapters about how she circumvented, you know, the patriarchy at the time to become a fighter pilot. Also, her sister's an archaeologist, you know, same thing, like how was that possible? I mean, yeah, women did go to school back then and stuff, but did she also, you know, go through some kind of hurdles? We don't really get that kind of story. I mean, this isn't really a story about that, but I don't think you can set women or any minority in that time period in like the 50s and not have a section about how they, you know, what they had to do to get where they were because of the barriers that were put against them. I know. Where was I? Also, the main character, or the main villain, Taylor, his motives were hit or miss. We don't really get any real glimpse into his and Sam's previous relationship or what Sam did for the Nine at all to kind of understand their dynamic. As a villain, he was extremely uninteresting, and Sam hardly seemed to even hate him. So I'm like, why would I hate him? You know, in truth, everybody was lacking a bit in substance. The dynamic with Jess could have been broadened and deepened to provide a much more kind of nuanced and substantial emotional range for sisters. Instead, we get a rather flimsy antagonism. You know, as a woman with two sisters, I understand hating each other as teens, but being utterly devoted to them as adults. And I still didn't really get their dynamic. I mean, I wasn't asking for, like, Frozen here, but but I also kind of was expecting a bit more Elsa and Anna. I've watched that movie so many times. Like, I've watched Frozen 2 so many times. I'm basically married to Elsa now. Yeah, toddlers. And so the third thing for me had nothing to do with the narrative craft at all. It's just something that is just, like, not my jam. Before I had children, I played a lot of video games. I was particularly fond of Fallout and Mass Effect. I have way too many hours clocked on Minecraft as well as other things. But what I don't like are stupid puzzle games. I hate puzzle games. I have no patience for them. I hated Tomb Raider. I even hate in Skyrim when you get into the dungeon and they're like, you know, unlock these 3 pillars to open the door. I'm like, no, I have freaking magic powers. I can just burst through the door. Like, stupid puzzle games. I hate, anyway. You know, I don't even bother anymore to do the puzzles. I just, like, go and find a walkthrough online. And my husband's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm cheating because I don't have time for this. I have a limited amount of time in the day, maybe an hour to play a video game, like 3 times a week, you know, so I'm not wasting it on trying to open a door. This novel has quite a bit of tomb raiding in it. Lots of puzzles and traps. As you know now, I absolutely hate puzzles. So, given the novel starts off like this, I think it didn't engage me from the start, and this kind of carried through to the whole book. So, the puzzles and stuff are actually described quite well. Like, I totally understood what they were doing and how they worked and stuff, so that was really well done. I just don't enjoy this type of thing. So, if you like puzzles, you'll probably really like this book, but I was not feeling it. The story picked up around the 50% mark for me, but in reading it, I felt like I was kind of playing Wolfenstein again because, like in most games, the protagonist gets basically near killed, you know, broken ribs, you know, beaten to a pulp, etc., etc., but she's still able to walk and fight and punch like she's in God mode. It was completely unrealistic, and, like, given her injuries, like, she never seems to sleep. I don't think she even eats. It was just, like, so over the top. That being said, though, even though there was a lot of violence, like, against her, it wasn't kind of icky violence against women. It seemed like she could hold her own, and so it wasn't like a power dynamic thing. It kind of reminded me of the movie Atomic Blonde with Charlize Theron. You know, I didn't hate the novel by any means. I didn't think it was poorly written. It just wasn't for me. You know, it sucks because the cover was so cool. I would, like, love to have it in my collection, but I'm not going to buy it if I'm never going to read it again. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 stars. I honestly think, though, a lot of people would really enjoy this book. Maybe I was just kind of rushing through it because my NetGalley, I took too many NetGalleys on, and they're all due in, like, September 8th, and I'm trying to get them done. So that's it. And, I mean, that's the end of my reviews. Sorry this one was kind of long. Sorry that my baby was squawking like a goat again and that we had some mishaps. Hello. So, after I'd finished editing and adding my little images to this review, I realized that I was missing a book. So I actually read 7 books in August. I'm going to just throw in this little review. It's kind of rushed, but I really liked this book, so I wanted to talk about it. So the book that I missed somehow was Devil's Road by Gary Gibson. It's a novella and it's a science fiction action book. I received this book from Book Sirens in exchange for a fair review. So, look at this cover. If there was ever a book whose energy and tone matched that of its contents, it is this book. It is exactly what you see here. I mean, Captain Moxley was a sweet cover too, but honestly, I think Devil's Road actually kills it. So let me preface by saying that I really like cars. I like to look at fancy exotic cars. I like to drive cars too fast. My husband and I go through cars like nothing. I think in the 10 years we've been together, we've gone through 10 cars. I can list them all off, but I'm not going to. We did have a BMW one time though, and that and the Jeep and the Ford Expedition and the Yukon were probably my favorite car. Anyway, I love cars, but my husband loves cars. Like, he can tell you about every car and every movie ever made. In fact, when I mentioned to him, hey, this book has a Falcon in it, he goes, oh, that's Mad Max's car. Like, without even thinking. Like, I like cars, but I don't know that. And he would be able to tell you the engine and everything in it. So, just a little bit of trivia about me that's probably pointless, but anyway, I love a good car chase movie. I prefer one with like a classic coupe involved, which this one has. I also like Death Race 2000, which is a fun movie, and Death Race, and Mad Max, of course. So I also have ghosts. I also have an unabashed love of Pacific Rim and previous enjoyment in my university days in my youth of Neon Genesis Evangelion. I tried to rewatch it when I was sick back in January, and yeah, it's still got great things about it, but it has some really dated things about it. But yeah, I guess you could say I do like kaiju. So I also love tough female leads. I mean, big surprise. So, like, was this book written for me? It seems like it was. Honestly, the only disappointing thing about this book is that it's a novella. Like, had it tacked on an extra 50 to 100 pages to give Dutch a proper backstory, beef up her tension with Nat, you know, make the race longer, it would have been amazing. Instead, we get a very fun and very exciting story, but one that feels like we're missing, you know, some serious character development opportunities. Like, don't get me wrong, like, Dutch is great, but there's other racers that were intriguing too that I wanted to learn about, and Nat doesn't really have, like, his motivations are kind of flat. We don't get enough of anyone really, and it's quite disappointing. But I will say, what is with these ghosts? Stop it. They're knocking my books off the shelves. Where was I? So the action scenes are super fun, but the entire race felt rushed. When I hit the 80% mark, you know, I was like, what? It's gonna wrap up in like 10 minutes of reading time? I don't get it. So, despite this major problem though, it is a really, really fun novel. It's so much fun. It starts off really cool with like a prison break. There's a bit of lack of exposition at the start that allows you to kind of tease out the state of the world, you know, there's little hints that are dropped. And we're not even introduced to the kaiju aspect until later, so that was a lot of fun. And despite feeling that, you know, you've emerged from a whirlwind when you're done, this book is a blast, and I really loved it. And I wish it were longer. I've already said that before. Anyway, I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. I recommend it to anybody that likes cars and tough female leads and kaiju monsters. Rawr. Thanks. Here's a video of my dogs. Thanks. Bye.